Good morning, everyone. We will be starting our presentation at 10 a.m. as we're waiting for others to join in.
Oh, it's 10 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our fall 2024 MFSN webinar. This is to review the proposed guideline changes for the 2025 Super NOFA guidelines. So if you are looking to make some comments on our proposed changes, you're definitely in the right place. All right, let's get started with our agenda today. And we expect the webinar to last approximately an hour and a half, so plan on that for your schedule. We will have a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to add your questions in the chat as they arise. If possible, please include your organization that you're representing. That would be great. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This video is being recorded. Closed captioning is available through your browser settings. My colleague Zach is going to drop in the chat some instructions on how to turn closed captioning on if you would like to. If you or a colleague need technical assistance during the webinar today, please notify us in the chat so our team can assist. As mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session at the end, but please add your questions to the chat as they arise. We'll try to answer the questions as much as we can in real time, and then we'll answer any remaining questions at the end of the presentation. Again, please add the organization you represent if possible. Webinar comments will not be included as official public comments. Public comments on the proposed guidelines may be submitted to our Super NOFA mailbox at supernofa@hcd.ca.gov until the public comment period closes on October 31st, 2024. And next, I'd like to introduce our MFSN leadership team as well as my co-presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Tony Surdich. He is the Assistant Deputy Director for the Department of State Financial Assistance. Gina Ferguson is the MFSN Branch Chief. Emily Burgos and Melissa Hardy-Swale are the MFSN Section Chiefs. And for your presenters today, my name is Stephanie Cotter. I am one of the MFSN Program Managers. Additionally, Becky Moe and Christina DiFrancesco, both very knowledgeable Specialist 2s with the Department of State Financial Assistance, will also be presenting today. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Tony Surdich, our Assistant Deputy Director, to say a few words.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for being here today. One of the big tasks that we always have in front of us every year is updating our new NOFA releases and guidelines to make sure that we're meeting the needs and the goals of our housing programs. So I want to thank everybody for their interest and in advance for your comments and feedback on the presentation and the guidelines that we have put out for comment. I also want to thank the Super NOFA leadership and staff for all their hard work in putting this together and gathering the improvements to the program that we can make for round 3. There was a lot of changes we made between round 1 and round 2 to improve the process. Round 3, we're proposing 3 areas really that we're really focused on in terms of making changes that you'll see today. The first and largest are the statutory changes that are required by legislation that is passed. You will hear a lot from Christina DiFrancesco on the AB 2438 changes, which regard supportive services. There's two large things there. One, MHP funds will be allowed to be used in certain circumstances for capitalized operating subsidy reserves. Christina will walk through the details on that. Additionally, we have recently put out a memo allowing increases to our supportive services cost caps for all department programs, or a majority of the department programs. The memo delineates all of that. Christina will walk through that as well. The second large area that we're focused on is aligning with our other programmatic areas around the state. So HCD housing programs, as well as SIDLAC and TCAC programs, making sure that the Super NOFA guidelines align with those as much as possible. And the third area is really continuing to streamline our review process and our threshold process to make sure that we are awarding the best projects that meet the state's housing goals. We want to make sure that we're not focusing on the technicalities that the projects may have, but really awarding the best projects that come to us. So we're continuing to work on that and refine our review process around that. So I'm looking forward to the presentation today. I'm looking forward to the feedback we receive. With that, I will kick it back to Stephanie to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Tony. So you might be wondering, many of you may know, but if you don't, what is MFSN? MFSN was authorized by AB 434 in 2020. It's the Multifamily Finance Super NOFA, and it provides housing developers with the option of applying for multiple HCD programs simultaneously. The various programs offer loan and gap funding to support the construction of multifamily affordable housing. These programs also focus on climate smart housing, transit-oriented developments, as well as specific target populations, such as agricultural workers, veterans, special needs and homeless populations, families, and seniors. All of our programs require a 55-year recorded regulatory agreement or covenant restricting tenant income and rent, and loans are subject to annual monitoring and compliance requirements. The 2025 NOFA will include funding for 3 of our programs. The first is the Multifamily Housing Program, which provides loans to assist with the new construction and rehabilitation of permanent affordable housing. The second is the Joe Cerna Jr. Farm Worker Housing Grant Program, which provides loans to assist the new construction and rehabilitation of permanent affordable renting housing, specifically for agricultural households. And third, IIG, which is the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. Excuse me, that's why we call it IIG. It's a mouthful. And that one provides grants to fund infrastructure that supports housing development. The eligible infrastructure could be anything from utility and street improvements to parks and bicycle transit support. The purpose, as Tony stated, the purpose of today's webinar is to gather feedback from our stakeholders on proposals that we're going to provide an overview for you today for program guideline changes that would go into effect before the 2025 funding round commences, which is planned in February. HCD released the draft guidelines on October 10th, and they are available on our website. The public comment period will close on October 31st. So if you would like to have your official public comments included in the record, please email supernofa@hcd.ca.gov so that we can include your comments. Now I'd like to turn it over to the MFSN branch chief, Gina Ferguson, to walk us through some of the proposed changes for the 2025 guidelines.
Thank you, Stephanie. As you've just heard, this presentation is to give a summary of the major proposed changes to the program guidelines of Multifamily Finance Super NOFA, or MFSN, and these will apply to the 2025 NOFA. So the previous slide did contain a link to the complete proposal documents, and there's also a summary memo of our webpage. We will email a PDF, make available a PDF of the summary to all attendees and all registrants after the presentation. In this slide, we're starting with general application requirements, a key one being eligible sponsor. Applications must meet all threshold requirements, one of which is an eligible sponsor as an applicant. One of the requirements of an eligible sponsor is experience in developing, operating, and owning an equivalent rental housing development. The proposed change in experience clarifies what is considered equivalent by setting a size metric, which is that the proposed development's total units are no more than 150% of the largest previously developed project. Proposed changes also add detail to the equivalent occupancy requirement, requiring experience with an equivalent percentage of restricted targeted population units. For example, if an application proposes 50 units for homeless households in a 100-unit development, the sponsor must demonstrate experience of at least one project with 50% of its units restricted for homeless households. Moving to this next bullet on the slide, we're proposing to revert to a former program practice of requiring only one applicant to meet all eligible sponsor requirements when there are co-applicants. This helps assist less experienced or inexperienced housing development organizations in gaining experience needed to qualify as an eligible sponsor in the future. For the next bullet, we're addressing sponsor activity after award has been made. When an application is awarded, the sponsor agrees to maintain continuing control of the rental housing development through the full term of the use restriction or regulatory agreement. Occasionally, issues arise that may require a sponsor to exit, and the changes to the guideline acknowledge this scenario. A note here, please, a change in sponsor is something that is done at the discretion of HCD. The guidelines lay out two different scenarios. In the first, when there are co-sponsors and only one eligible sponsor, as was just previously described, after 7 years, the experienced sponsor may exit with the less experienced sponsor assuming control and management duties. In the second scenario, a third party may replace the original eligible sponsor if that replacement entity has an equivalent status as the original sponsor, including having the necessary experience and capacity. And again, this must be approved by HCD. Okay, moving on to other threshold requirements. The change at the bottom of this slide requires commitments for all construction and permanent financing with the exception of bond financing and tax credits. The Super NOFA, we're proposing to increase the readiness of projects applying for MFSN funding. The Super NOFA program offers the opportunity to receive awards from multiple loan and grant programs simultaneously, as Stephanie just went over on a previous slide. And that also envisioned that projects with our awards will next submit to SIDLAC or TCAC for an application. So this proposal is also a cost containment measure, working to award projects that are ready to begin construction, but for an award of low-income housing tax credit or tax exempt on financing. Continuing with other threshold requirements, the first proposed change on this slide requires the market study to document that there's sufficient demand for an application's project type or target population. This is already a requirement by inclusion in the TCAC market study guidelines, but we are emphasizing it in these proposed changes because of ongoing issues experienced at the time of initial tenant lease-up. Too often, HCD is asked to reduce restrictions on targeted populations such as agricultural households or veterans because owners and property managers can't find residents for these units at the time of the initial lease-up. So to ensure that the market for targeted populations was sufficiently demonstrated and researched initially, we are going to be closely reviewing the market studies documented support of targeted populations in our application reviews, and you'll see that as outlined in the draft guide. Next, a correction of a wording error that was made between first and second set of guidelines, which is to clarify that the threshold requirement for local land use entitlements and approvals is documentation of status, not complete approval. Another clarification on this slide, this one related to the timing requirement of environmental site assessment report. The general requirement that exists is that the report is no more than 12 months old. The proposed change is to clarify how this applies to phase 1 and phase 2 reports. If a phase 1 is revealed contamination and a phase 2 is required, the 12-month report date applies to the phase 2, and the recommending phase 1 can exceed the 12-month requirement. Moving to underwriting requirements, we're proposing to eliminate the practice of requiring 2 separate underwriting reviews when rents in the application are less than the maximum area median income targeted identified in the application. The change retains underwriting to the restricted or maximum rents, which is consistent with underwriting that occurs post-award and consistent with rent restrictions monitored through the regulatory agreement. The proposal recognizes that duplicative underwriting is not necessary, and it can be challenging for an application's pro forma cash flow to comply with two separate underwriting scenarios. The change also emphasizes the importance of matching targeted AMIs with rents charged to tenants in the context of market demand and aligning AMIs with other public restrictions. Moving on, we have some proposed changes that are based on recent statutory changes. Senate Bill 469 modified California's Health and Safety Code to exclude programs operated or administered by HCB from the requirements of Article 34 of the California Constitution. Many of us are probably familiar with this, but just a quick summary. Elimination of Article 34 requirements means that a multifamily rental project seeking HCB funding will no longer be required to provide evidence that the project complies with or is exempt from Article 34's requirement, which is that this housing cannot be developed or constructed without a majority vote of local electors. As a result, HCB-assisted units are no longer limited to 49%. 100% of the units may receive HCB assistance if the application's funding gap supports this level of funding assistance, and it obviously would be subject to other limitations specified in the NOFA, such as a maximum award amount per project. And as noted in the slide, the integration limitation requirements remain in effect. Article 34 and integration both use 49% as a limiting percentage, but are completely different and unrelated limitations. No more than 49% of total units may be restricted through HCB regulatory agreements to occupancy by persons with disabilities. The integration requirement is separate and remains in effect. Assembly Bill 894 requires an examination of the feasibility of shared parking agreements to replace new parking. This includes the identification of nearby facilities available for shared parking with the goal of reducing or limiting the number of new parking spaces constructed. The study is not required to be included in the application, but applicants must commit to submitting the report to HC prior to the execution of the standard agreement. We also have some program-specific changes proposed. For MHP, the percentage of program funds in the NOFA to be awarded to senior housing developments is increasing very slightly to 21%. The MHP statute requires this percentage to be the proportion of low-income renter households that are seniors, and we run this calculation with each NOFA. The proposed requirements for the SERNA program highlight the importance of connecting agricultural and farm workers with permanent housing options. A sponsor's plan for leasing must provide for outreach or marketing to migrant farm worker populations residing in Office of Migrant Services or OMS centers within a 100-mile radius. The IIG program proposed change removes as an eligible use of IIG funds residential structured parking that does not also serve a transit station. This is aimed at refocusing the use of IIG funding to infrastructure improvements that further state info priorities. Moving on to proposed changes aimed at easing some of the challenges of the application evaluation process. First on this slide is language added to guidelines that more clearly articulates the application review process. Guidelines in NOFA address threshold and scoring in some level of detail, but there's a third component of the application review, which is feasibility and underwriting. The proposed change identifies the feasibility and underwriting review that occurs in addition to threshold and scoring reviews, and it also clarifies the existing practice of allowing for limited application corrections outside the appeals process as part of feasibility and underwriting review. The proposed changes also include the ability to assess the majority of organizational documents as part of feasibility review, removing them from the threshold review, and when deficient, from disqualification and appeals process. This does not remove the requirement for submitting complete organizational documents. It removes it to this latter stage of application review. As part of threshold review, our staff will still need to assess a minimum level of org doc completeness to establish eligible sponsor and a sponsor site control. More detail on those minimum requirements will be included in NOFA and the application materials. And last on this slide, we continue to refine what a complete application means in terms of minor and correctable errors and omissions. The 2023 NOFA permitted staff to request clarifying information for minor threshold and scoring issues through an appeals process. We expect to expand this ability to a degree for the 2025 NOFA, and the details of the changes will be in the NOFA, although they are also referenced in our draft guidance. The NOFA will be published in February, and it does not use a public comment process. Given that we do highlight this process of application, clarifications, and corrections in these draft guidelines, I do encourage anyone interested in helping us define those parameters to submit proposals through the public comment process of the guidelines. And now Becky will take over and walk through developer fee limits and our new use of MHB funding for capitalized operating subsidy reserves.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. And good morning, everyone. My name is Becky Mo. And just like Gina presented, Super NOFA team, we heard your voice, and we are doing our best to further streamline. And we are trying to alleviate the stress for you to obtain the gap funding. So today I'm here, I want to present some good news to you. And the first one is the increase, as well as we are trying to streamline with the TCAT about the increase of the developer fee. So on the screen, you will be able to see that the 9% tax credit project, as well as the non-tax credit new construction projects. For these projects, the proposal is to increase the maximum developer fee limits from 2.5 million to 2.8 million if the project satisfies the requirement. So the requirement is the project needs to reserve 25% of its restricted units for special needs population, and with 15 units as the minimum. So what does it mean? We can use an example here. So let's say we have a project with 40 restricted units, and 25% of 40 is 10, right? However, 10 units doesn't get us the increase of the developer fee because the minimum requirement is 15 units. So in this specific example, we want 15 units reserved for special needs population for the project to be eligible for a bigger developer fee. So that's for 9% and non-tax credit projects. As for 4% tax credit projects, we propose 2 layers of increase. So the first one is we want to increase in the cash out developer fee limit. So that's the first one. And we have an additional layer of increase. That is, if the project again meets the 25% requirement, we give you a second layer of increase. I know this is very conceptual, and we can use some examples to show you how great these increases are. So let's go to the next slide. On the slides, the example we have here is this is a 4% new construction project. And the total development cost is 55 million. And 50 million is the unadjusted eligible basis. So with all this information, the total developer fee is 7.5 million. And with the previous regulation, the maximum cash out developer fee is only 2.5 million. But now with the new regulation for the first layer, we are able to increase it from 2.5 to 3.2 to be cash out and 4.3 to be deferred. So that's the first layer of increase. And the second layer is if the project satisfies the 25% requirement. So if you satisfy, then the maximum cash out is 4 million with 3.5 million as deferred. So you will see how great it is, because if the project satisfies, both layers, we are able to jump straight from 2.5 to 4 million for the cash out developer fee. And on TCAC website, there is a calculator. It's very wonderful. And if you are questioning how much you're eligible for the total developer fee and how much you can cash out, how much to be deferred, you can go to the website and find a calculator. And it's also on the slide too. It's an amazing tool, I have to say that. And so the good news for Supernova team that we want to bring to you doesn't end with developer fee increase. We also have other incentives and reserves. So, back to AB 2483 implementation. So the bill passed and it brought some changes to Supernova Round 3 MHP program guideline. So the first proposal is now MHP can kick in the form of a grant to serve as a co-czar to support a project operation. Second, is MHP money can be used as a capitalized reserve to pay for the supportive services. Third, last but not the least, is the MHP program propose incentives for projects that partner with Medi-Cal-funded supportive services providers. So I know we couldn't wait to dive into the details, right? So first, let's go into the reserves. So the reserve is only available for MHP program, and the project has to qualify for special needs project type. And the reserve will land on units restricted at 30% AMI or below. So that's the requirement. And in Supernova Round 3, the funding availability for co-czar is 50 million. So applicants have to submit the request for both co-czar as well as the MHP capital funding in their application. And we all know MHP funds are so popular, so you want to make sure the project you proposed rank high enough to receive both awards. And there are 3 ways of calculating the size of the co-czar. And the first one is by per unit subsidy amount, which is $195,000 per qualified unit. And the second way is HCD, we will do underwriting. We will use 20 years as the basis, and we will use restricted rents to do the calculation. So we want to size how much we need to bring the negative cash flow back to 0. So pretty much we want to use the co-czar to resolve the operating deficit. So that's the second method. And the last is the applicant request. Because all the projects are in different situations. Some of the projects and the applicants, they have more local support than the others. So if it is not needed, and then the applicant requests less than the maximum co-czar they are eligible for, then we go by that request. So we have 3 methods, and HCD we take the amount, the lesser of the 3. And once you receive the co-czar award, I want to point out that the co-czar will be held by the department. And by the time of term close, HCD will do the underwriting again. And if by that time, the co-czar is determined not needed for the project, HCD may reduce the co-czar award amount. And for more information, you can go to the MHP draft guideline, section 7304.1 for more details. And let's turn the time to Christina for the MHP co-czar, as well as the Medi-Cal incentives for the MHP program. It's your time, Christina.
Okay, thanks, Becky. I appreciate it. Nice to be with everybody today. So Becky talked a little bit about the kosher. It is based on the No Place Like Home or NPLH model. So those of you who are familiar with that and have gotten kosher through NPLH, the administration is essentially right now as proposed going to be very similar. I'm going to talk about some other tools in the toolbox per the AB 2483 legislation, which is passed. A second tool for reserves that we have that we kind of rebirthed through AB 2483 is the use of a supportive services reserve. This reserve will also be provided in the form of a grant, as will the kosher, but it is specifically proposed for use only for case management and resident services coordination in supportive housing. So while the kosher covers the operating deficit of the project, generally speaking, attributable to those kosher assisted units with some limited exception for expenses that aren't covered, which you'll see in the draft guidelines. The supportive housing, supportive services reserve is just for case management and resident services coordination. And that's based on really current UMR parameters for this reserve. It can be capitalized through the development budget or funded through project cash flow at no more than 3 times the current cost caps permitted by HCD for services funded through the project budget. So I'll talk a little bit later on about our newly established cost caps in Admin Notice 2405, which we just recently issued, which increased those caps. So you will get an opportunity then to fund a larger supportive services reserve, capitalized or through project cash flow, than you would have in the past because those cost caps have significantly increased. Unlike the kosher, this reserve is proposed to be held by the project with withdrawal amounts and the term regulated by the project. So it's not necessarily going to be required to be a 20-year reserve like the kosher, but it is subject to AMC approval for withdrawals similar to other project held reserves. Supportive services reserves capitalized through the development budget will also be subject to MHP's overall award limits as announced in the annual NOFA. Next slide, please. A third tool in our toolbox is the Medi-Cal provider partnership incentives under AB 2483. And this is a brand new initiative for HCD, really. These incentives will provide increased per unit amounts for residential space and for on-site supportive services space, with the main policy objective being to encourage projects to secure some form of or some level of support for services through Medi-Cal. So not just funding services through your project budget, but trying to bring down some Medi-Cal resources for your tenants. Specifically, AB 2483 focuses on 3 Medi-Cal supportive service streams, serving homeless households as defined in the AB 2483 statute, which I'll discuss shortly. These incentives can be provided to eligible homeless households in any project type. Currently, we're not proposing restrictions to MHP special needs project types for these Medi-Cal supported households. So while the kosher is restricted to special needs units and the supportive service reserves is only for supportive housing units, the Medi-Cal, we wanted to have a broader focus to try to help as many tenants access services provided through their Medi-Cal coverage as possible. Next slide, please. The 3 programs of focus are the Program for All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, or PACE, the Assisted Living Waiver, or ALW, and the Home and Community-Based Alternatives Waiver, or HCBA. The links to the Department of Healthcare Services websites for each of these programs are embedded in the PowerPoint that you'll receive at the conclusion of the session. And they will provide basic information on the services offered, as well as other basic program parameters. The focus of PACE, ALW, and HCBA is assisting persons who have been determined by DHCS to require a nursing facility level of care to live independently with long-term services and supports in housing. So a really high need population through these programs. PACE targets persons who are ages 55 and up, and ALW and HCBA serve adults of any age with disabilities. For all three programs, the focus through AB 2483 is service to homeless households. Next slide, please. Okay, so how is homeless defined? It's defined in two ways. First, it includes persons who qualify under the federal HUD definition of homelessness, which most of us should be already familiar with. But it also includes persons who were homeless prior to entering an institutional setting, or who lost their housing as a result of stay in an institution. For these institutional exits, the length of stay in the institution does not matter. So I don't know if some of you are familiar with the HUD definition, but it has a particular limitation on length of stay related to homeless status. This does not have that. So someone could be in the hospital for one day, for example, or in a correctional facility for several years. It doesn't matter. If they were homeless prior to coming in or homeless when they exit, they will qualify as homeless for purposes of receiving the benefits under these initiatives. The PACE, ALW, or HCBA service provider will make initial determinations of service eligibility, which DHCS will later verify once the person has moved into the MHP restricted unit. Next slide, please. Your working relationship with your PACE, ALW, or HCBA service provider or providers, if you want to serve, for example, elderly under PACE and non-elderly under HCBA, is important to help ensure that services are available when needed. ALW and HCBA are subject to 5-year renewal periods by the Federal Center for Medicaid Services. There are a limited number of slots for these services. However, DHCS does have a process for opening up slots in each covered county. So you'll need to work closely with your eligible Medi-Cal service provider, whom you'll partner with as part of this initiative, prior to your project lease up to ensure that the household members and the units restricted by MHP as having received these incentives have services available to them when they want to access them. Per the DHCS websites for service streams, for these service streams, ALW is currently authorized to operate in 15 counties. HCBA has about 50 counties across the state, and PACE as well, a similar size, multiple counties around the state, as well as service providers organized by zip code. So you'll have to see the DHCS websites, the links in the PowerPoint, for the current list of areas served, as well as a list of service providers serving those areas within each program. And that's how you'll figure out who you want to partner with. Next slide, please. Okay, so in exchange for partnering to provide Medi-Cal services in housing, the low limits for the residential and on-site supportive service space of these assisted units will be increased, and those increases will be announced in each annual NOFA. Project team responsibilities in return for these higher per unit limits are as follows. First, you must set aside at least 20% of your project units for eligible households under these incentives. But if your project includes more than 100 units, you can set aside no more than 50% of those units for these incentives. And again, there's no restriction to just special needs housing type projects. Next slide, please. So this slide lists the remaining developer responsibilities. I'm just going to read through them one by one and make a few comments. You must enter into a written agreement with your eligible service provider or providers to offer the Medi-Cal services. We're going to provide you a sample MOU written agreement with the application to make that process a lot easier. We have a companion program that operates under ALW and HCBA through CalHFA that we've been operating in collaboration with them for about 10 years now. And we have an MOU developed through that, which we will tailor specifically for AB 2483. So we will have that piece done for you. Secondly, you must accept tenant referrals from a local coordinated entry system. State law requires that all homeless persons be referred through CES. And since this AB 2483 statute considers persons exiting institution who've been homeless prior to entering the institution or are homeless upon exit as homeless, you'll need to make sure, working closely with your service provider and CES, that these institutional exits can be referred through the CES and reach your project. You'll need to work with your eligible service provider to not only facilitate the timely expedited CES referral, but timely assessment for eligibility for the Medi-Cal services, assistance with the tenant application process, assistance with move-in, and the ongoing provision of supportive services. Our experience with the CalHFA program with this high need population is there needs to be a lot of coordination prior to initial lease up and through initial lease up between the service provider and the property management agent to make sure that the lease up occurs in a timely manner and is expeditious, and that people have the assistance they need to move into the units and that the services are flowing when needed. A lot of these people, have been in institutions for quite some time. They don't necessarily have, for example, all of the documentation needed to apply to reside in your project. Many of them, for example, don't have a current SSI award letter. They may not have current ID. They have been in institutions for a long time. They don't have bank statements. They don't have access to employment or prior employment records, et cetera. So all of that takes a lot of boots on the ground to help people gather that documentation. Many times while they're still in the nursing facility setting, for example, so that when they're able to exit, their application is ready to go and their move can be smooth. And then once they're in the units, there's adjustment periods for people who have not lived in housing for a while and getting used to service provision and just living on their own. So a lot of coordination between property managers and service providers is necessary to make sure that things are going smoothly and to try to avoid situations that may escalate into eviction. So that team approach is something that we really try to do in the CalHFA program and would encourage people to continue in this initiative. Ensuring that tenants qualify for their Medi-Cal and that is consistent with the AMI levels that you've set for your restricted units will also be very important. We don't have a specific AMI restriction associated with these Medi-Cal assisted units. partly because I don't know how Medi-Cal eligibility limits will change over time. And the Medi-Cal ALW and HCBA limits are different from the PACE limits because different populations are being served, elderly and non-elderly. So you'll want to have a conversation with your service provider prior to submitting the MHP application around what the limits are now for the populations you want to serve and how they project that those limits might increase over time so that the AMI percentage that you set makes sense with the income limit for the Medi-Cal beneficiary at time of lease up. You also need to make sure that the housing and the services are provided in accordance with Housing First. That, of course, is state law for all persons who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. A lot of those Housing First requirements we've incorporated into the MOU. And so that should be familiar to you, but also reinforced through the MOU. And so you want to take a look at that. And as I said earlier, be willing to meet with us and your service provider team and DHCS to ensure that everything's happening smoothly in the partnership, that people are transitioning out of homelessness, out of institutional settings. Those transitions are happening smoothly. The rent-up process is happening smoothly, and the access to services is there, and the services are flowing when needed. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on from Medi-Cal, I wanted to talk a little bit about the administrative memo, a administrative notice 2405 that the department just issued a couple of weeks ago. This increased the cost limits for all DSFA rental housing programs for supportive services funded through the project budget, as announced in the memo. So I'm really excited about the fact that it was wide in its birth. Unfortunately, we weren't able to include the federal programs for some technical reasons, but we got all the DSFA state-funded source programs included. This notice was a result of extensive research and collaboration that we've done over the past 2 years in partnership with AMC and external stakeholders to determine the appropriate caps for supportive services funded through the project budget based on current salary levels for case managers and supervisors, taking into account best practices for supportive service provision, as well as some program client to staff required ratios and the operational needs and constraints in a typical rental housing project budget. Next slide, please. So what you'll see on this slide are two tables. The first sets forth the current limits under the, I shouldn't say they're current anymore, the limits under the Uniform Multifamily Regulations. And the second are the new limits under the Notice 2405. These changes apply to all projects subject to the current cost caps. So not only projects that are in the pipeline that will be starting their process of securing funding, but existing projects in the AMC portfolio, as they get their annual operating budgets approved, can now, if they have sufficient cash flow, take advantage of these new higher cost caps. So the categories for the cost caps were streamlined. What we did essentially is we took the first two categories under the UMRs and collapsed them into one. So now all homeless and special needs units will be able to take advantage of a higher cost cap beginning in 2025 of $10,000 per unit per year. And then for a new second tier cost cap being other non-homeless and special needs populations where there is qualified staff devoted exclusively to oversight and quality control of resident services, as well as a system to track and report tenant outcomes. This new second tier amount also increased. It will start at $4,000 per unit per year for that population. And then the final tier, which is everything else, we didn't make any changes to that tier. So if you happen to be utilizing our program where that tier's amount is already higher than the base limit under the UMRs, that will remain the same. We did change the escalator on all of the supportive services caps in all tiers. So they're now annually escalating from the base limit at 3.5% per year rather than 2.5% per year. And we put in a process where we're going to be reevaluating every 3 years the cost caps so that we can keep up to date on current salaries required for case managers and supervisors, looking also at best practices again, staff to client ratios, and project operational costs. We wanted a system in place so we didn't have to wait until the next UMR revision or, 7 to 10 years out to be able to look at these caps and say, do they need some adjustment? So I hope this gets you some flexibility in terms of use of project cash flow for your services. So I guess my final word, as you think about all these various tools that we've talked about, the COSR, the Supportive Services Reserve, accessing Medi-Cal incentives through PACE, ALW, HCBA, and the new flexibility to fund services through the project budget and project cash flow. Just consider how these can be used either alone or in combination to serve your proposed target population, right? Really look at the population you're trying to serve, have conversations about gaps in services that you see now with that proposed target population, talk with your service provider team and your property management team to really suss that out, because all of these resources have limitations, right? And so it may make sense for you to use one of the tools or a combination of the tools, but I think you really want to be targeted about that because some of them are capitalized and that is a consideration for you in planning your project development budget out as well as your operating budget. So think carefully about all of that as you think about, which of these makes sense for you to utilize in a given situation, in a given project. But, at the end of the day, we hope it gives you a lot of options and resources for being able to improve access to services as well as service quality for your tenants. And so I really appreciate all your time today, and I look forward to working with all of you in the coming months as we continue to roll this out, and look forward to your comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was extremely helpful in walking us through some of the complexities of AB 2483 implementation. And we're really excited that these are in our draft guidelines, available for public comment, and getting to the next stage of implementation. We wanted to take a break, let you gather some thoughts. We're proposing to break until 11, come back at 11 and have a Q&A session. We are, just for technical management purposes, just doing questions through the chat. So please post your questions in the chat. We've allotted up to 30 minutes for questions if needed. And so we'll all just take about a 7-minute break here, kind of reset and come back. But in the meantime, if you have those questions, please put them in. We'll do our best to answer them as completely as we can in live time. And if you aren't ready for questions and need a little bit more time, please use our Super NOFA at hcd.ca.gov. We'll be actively monitoring that through this public comment period, so that if you aren't ready to ask clarifying questions yet, but have some in a couple days. We'll absolutely be looking for those questions there too. So let's just take a pause. We'll all go off camera on mute, and then we'll be back. If there are questions, we'll be back at 11 to answer the questions. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're back. Thanks for that break. I just wanted to go over a couple of things that we may have already said, but as we're getting close to closing, just want to reiterate them. We do plan to publish a recording of this webinar, including any question and answer session that we've got going here. We've got the Supernova email in the chat for where to send questions after this. Let's see. We've got a few questions here. We'll be here until 11:30. If we don't have any more questions coming in, we'll end early, but we're going to go with the first question that we've got unanswered here, and I'll kick that over to Zach. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question that we haven't answered yet looks like, so the HCBA website says that new applicants to the HCBA waiver should be aware that the program has reached maximum capacity and a waiting list has been implemented effective July 12, 2023. Can we still make use of the incentives? And this is from Sage Housing Group.
Yes, you can. The waivers are reapplied for typically every 5 years. So by the time these projects are ready to lease up, right, assuming you're new construction, and you start construction by 2027, and then you're ready to lease up by 2029, we suspect that there will be a new waiver in place, or at least we haven't gotten an indication from DHCS that that will not be the case. So we fully suspect that you will still be able to offer the incentives, or you will be able to access them at the point of project lease up. We will remain in consistent communication with DHCS, and as things change, or if they were to change and evolve, we would notify folks accordingly. But at this point, all systems are still a go for getting projects in the pipeline that can take advantage of them in this next waiver cycle.
All right, and then next question from Jose with Soldado Construction Inc. He says, do I have to be an organization to apply for this program? I'm a DVBE construction company, Disabled Veteran Business Enterprise Construction Company.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Yes, generally that is the case. And there is a certain minimum level of experience. But I would encourage you to inquire further by contacting our Supernova mailbox. We can provide you with some very specific references and snippets of the guidelines that would apply for what you're interested in exploring. And I also wanted to take this question as a great opportunity for us to talk about. We do have areas in our guidelines that we didn't cover today because we're only covering the proposed changes, which really are for emerging developers in terms of giving emerging developers access to our program. So we can give more information about that to you as we through that Supernova mailbox. And also wanted to highlight that we have more information coming. So this is our first step. We've got the draft guidelines. We'll do public comment period and have the final guidelines, and then we'll issue the NOFA. And once we do that, there's more opportunity for technical assistance. So once you have all the information about the funding that's available, you can see what the full requirements of the NOFA are. We can do one-on-one technical assistance meetings. We are available for that. So just contact us now. We can give you some preliminary information. But as the funding opportunities get closer, we have more and more resources and availability to give you that to help provide information about eligibility particularly for folks who are emerging developers.
All right, and then now I'll just go back up to some questions that were already answered in the chat, but I'll go ahead and vocalize them so everybody can hear in case anybody didn't get a chance to see them. First question is, what regulations will apply to properties previously receiving MHP funding? And the answer to that is if this is a previous award, the requirements from previous guidelines and the NOFA still apply.
If I could just add to that, Zach.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Becky, for answering that. That was really helpful. There is an area on the HCD website. I'll drop a link in the chat that shows our administrative memos. And so any administrative memo that is like the supportive service cap that sets something new that may be applicable in older cases, it's found in this memo area of the website. It's sometimes a little tricky to navigate. I'll put the link in the chat. What you do when you click on that link is scroll down and there are some boxes. I'll do a picture too. And there's a memo box. And so there's links for all of our current memos in there. And so that kind of helps you navigate. The default always is that the guidelines and regulations that were in effect when you receive the award remain inapplicable. And then you review the memos to see if there were any changes that might apply to past awards and past guidelines. That's a great question. Thank you.
All right, and then the next question is, are UMR developer fee limits applicable to MHP? And then the answer to that was per MHP program guidelines, section 7305B1, UMR section 8312A, C, and D shall not apply.
Yes, I can add on a little bit more details to that. So because we are trying to increase the developer fee limits, and more than that, we're also trying to align with TCAC, for the increase. So let me see, A, C, and D is not applicable from UMR, but all the other sections still applicable, such as B. But B, section 8312B, it refers to TCAC for the 9% developer fee calculation. So we're on the same page on that point. And besides B, such as E and F in UMR, those are still applicable.
All right, so it looks like we have another question here that came in. Will the timeline for awards align with TCAC and CIDLAC, the TCAC and CIDLAC timeline when it is published?
So we have a snippet at the beginning of the presentation, and I know a lot of people were not able to join right at the beginning at the top of the hour, and we did start on time. And so we will make this available. Please know anyone who's attending here will have that information available. The NOFA calendar has us making awards in August of 2025. So that should give, it's unknown at this point, I think, what the 2025 calendar is for TCAC, whether CIDLAC will have a late final round. If that is the case, these awards could dovetail with that. Otherwise, I think the expectation is that the August date gives a lot of good lead time for the next calendar year, 2026 for TCAC and CIDLAC.
And as of right now, that looks like the last question in the chat. Oh, I guess there is one other one from earlier. It says, where do we find the supportive services cost memo and notice? And Gina, I believe you dropped a link in the chat for that memo, if anyone is needing that.
Yes, thank you. And just in that link, you must scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, and then there's a memos tab. Click on that memos tab, and then the first memo is the most recent one, which is the supportive. So if you're on that page, if you hover over that, you should also be able to see the NOFA calendar as well. We did a little snippet of our program, but the entire NOFA calendar for all the expected NOFAs in 2025 is there too.
And I also put the actual PDF link in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Zach, is that all the questions we've got?
Yes, ma'am. I don't see any other questions in the chat as of right now.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. We know that it was a lot of condensed information in a short period of time. We appreciate your time today, and also just know if you have follow-up questions, we will all be available as well through that Super NOFA mailbox. And we look forward to hearing from you, and we welcome and look forward to your public comments during this period. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.